Imagine you're standing in your kitchen late at night. The house is quiet, the air is cool, and you're feeling that familiar, prickling dry sensation in the back of your throat. You reach into the cabinet, pull out a clean glass, and hold it under the tap. You flick a lever. Instantly, a stream of perfectly clear, odorless, tasteless liquid rushes out. You don't examine it. You don't sniff it for the scent of rot or check it for the slight, oily shimmy of a parasite. You just tilt your head back and drink. In less than 10 seconds, you've performed an act that would have looked like a death-defying miracle to almost every human being who lived before the last century. You've just consumed a biological product you trust with your life, despite having no idea where it actually came from or what's hidden inside it. But for your ancestors, that same glass of water wasn't a refreshment. It was a riddle that, if answered incorrectly, would kill you in 48 hours. To stay alive, they had to develop a sixth sense for the invisible, a way to read the secrets of the earth and the whispers of the wind just to find a single safe sip. We like to think of our ancestors as surviving by the skin of their teeth, stumbling through the wilderness and drinking from any puddle they found. But the reality is far more calculated and, frankly, far more sensory. Before there were laboratories or microscopes, there was the human body, a highly tuned instrument designed to detect danger long before it reached the stomach. Imagine walking through a dense, humid forest 50,000 years ago. Your mouth is parched, your tongue feels like a piece of dry leather, and the heat is a physical weight on your shoulders. You find a pool of water. It's still, shaded by low-hanging branches and perfectly reflective. Most people today would see that as a peaceful oasis. An ancient human would see it as a graveyard. They understood, through a visceral, inherited kind of wisdom, that stillness is often a mask for decay. They looked for the movement. They listened for the sound of water tumbling over stones, a rhythmic, bubbling music that suggested the water was being tossed and turned, aerated by the air and scrubbed by the rocks. This wasn't just a preference for aesthetics, it was a primitive understanding of oxygenation. Moving water is harder for dangerous bacteria to colonize. It's a living thing, whereas the still pond is a dying one. Still, movement wasn't always enough to guarantee safety, and that's where the other senses took over. Our ancestors were master smellers. They could detect the faint, metallic tang of iron, the eggy sulfur of volcanic activity, or the sweet, cloying scent of decomposing organic matter from dozens of yards away. If a stream smelled like wet earth and crushed stone, it was likely safe. If it had even the slightest hint of something off, a scent of stagnant rot or the ammonia of animal waste, they kept walking even if their bodies were screaming for hydration. They watched the plants too. Certain reeds and lilies only grow in water that is relatively clean, while others thrive in the nutrient-rich, bacteria-heavy runoff of a swamp. To an ancient nomad, the landscape wasn't just a collection of trees and dirt, it was a map of hydration where every leaf and every shadow was a data point. They were reading a water quality report written in the language of biology. Of course, the animals were the ultimate informants, though trusting them was its own kind of gamble. If you saw a herd of healthy deer drinking regularly from a specific bend in a river, that was a strong endorsement. Animals have evolved their own complex sets of internal alarms. But you had to be careful. A predator lying in wait near a watering hole wasn't the only risk. If the animals were avoiding a source that looked clean, the humans followed suit. They noticed when birds didn't land near a lake or when the local frogs were silent. This was a form of crowdsourced survival. If the rest of the kingdom was staying away, there was likely a chemical or biological reason that the human nose couldn't quite catch. By tethering their survival to the instincts of the creatures around them, humans effectively outsourced their safety to a much older, more experienced set of biological sensors.
But these external signs were only the first layer of defense, and sometimes the senses were flat out lied to by nature. You could find a stream that looked crystalline, smelled like mountain air, and flowed over beautiful white pebbles, only to have it be a carrier for a microscopic killer. This is where the human story takes a turn from passive observation to active intervention. The most revolutionary tool we ever discovered wasn't the wheel or the spear, it was the well. By digging into the earth, our ancestors tapped into a hidden, subterranean world that the sun and the wind couldn't touch. They realized that water drawn from deep underground was almost always safer than water sitting on the surface. They didn't have a word for filtration, but they understood the result. They watched as muddy rain soaked into the soil and vanished, and they realized that the earth was acting as a giant, hungry sponge that pulled the filth out of the liquid as it traveled downward. In places like the Altschübitz region of Germany, archaeologists have discovered wooden well linings that date back over 7,000 years. These weren't just holes in the ground. They were sophisticated engineering projects lined with oak timbers, designed to keep the walls from collapsing while the water seeped in from the surrounding aquifer. These wells represent a massive shift in human psychology. It was the moment we decided that nature's offerings weren't good enough and that we had to go looking for the good stuff ourselves. The water in these wells was cool, protected from the waste of animals, and shielded from the algae that blooms in the sunlight. It was the birth of the protected source, a concept that still forms the backbone of modern public health. Even without knowing about germs, these early farmers were practicing a form of environmental hygiene that saved millions of lives. However, the earth is a fickle filter, and sometimes the very ground that was supposed to clean the water ended up poisoning it with minerals like arsenic or lead. This realization, that even the most protected water could be a trap, pushed humanity toward the next great breakthrough: the use of fire. We often think of the discovery of fire in terms of warmth or cooking meat, but its impact on water was arguably more important for the long-term survival of the species. The practice of boiling water is ancient, mentioned in Sanskrit texts from thousands of years ago and depicted in Egyptian tomb paintings. Our ancestors didn't know they were killing heat-sensitive pathogens. They likely thought they were softening the water or driving out bad spirits that caused the cramps of the belly. They saw the steam rising and the bubbles roiling, and they noticed that the people who drank this transformed water didn't get the wasting sicknesses that plagued everyone else. It was a technological shield built on a foundation of total mystery. Yet, as effective as boiling was, it was also incredibly resource-intensive. Fire requires fuel, and fuel requires labor. In a world where every calorie spent searching for wood was a calorie taken away from hunting or gathering, boiling every drop of water you drank was often impossible. So humans found a loophole. They discovered that you didn't necessarily have to kill the things in the water with heat if you could create an environment where they simply couldn't grow. This was the era of fermentation. All over the world, from the rice wines of ancient China to the barley beers of Mesopotamia, humans began transforming their water into something else. They added grains or fruits, let them sit, and watched as the liquid began to bubble and change. What they were actually doing was using yeast to create alcohol and lower the pH of the liquid, creating a chemical barrier that most dangerous bacteria couldn't cross. In ancient Sumer, beer was so central to survival that they had a goddess, Ninkasi, dedicated specifically to its brewing. The hymn to Ninkasi isn't just a poem, it's a set of instructions for making a safe, storable beverage. This small beer, as it would later be known in medieval Europe, was low in alcohol but high in safety. It was often safer for a child to drink a weak ale than it was for them to drink from the local stream. It sounds counterintuitive to us today, the idea of giving a toddler a beer, but in the context of ancient survival, it was a brilliant public health hack. They were using the power of fermentation to pre-filter their hydration, turning a liability into a stable, nutritious asset. It was a way to store clean water in a form that wouldn't spoil, allowing civilizations to grow in places where the natural water supply was questionable at best.
But alcohol and boiling were still small-scale solutions, and as humans began to huddle together in the first great cities, the water problem reached a breaking point. When you have 10,000 people living in a square mile, you can no longer rely on everyone finding their own clean well or brewing their own beer. The waste of the city begins to choke the life out of the surrounding landscape, and the local water sources become a concentrated soup of disease. This is where the engineers stepped in. If you couldn't find safe water nearby, you had to go and get it from somewhere else. The Roman Empire is the most famous example of this conquest of distance, building massive, gravity-fed aqueducts that stretched for dozens of miles across the countryside. They tapped into mountain springs, far away from the filth of the city, and channeled that purity directly into the heart of Rome. The sheer scale of this was mind-boggling. By the 1st century AD, the city of Rome was receiving hundreds of millions of gallons of fresh water every single day. This wasn't just for drinking, it was for the massive public baths and the fountains that cooled the air. The Romans had a designated water commissioner, like the famous Sextus Julius Frontinus, who obsessively documented the quality and flow of the city's various sources. They even understood that different aqueducts provided different grades of water. Some were reserved for drinking because they were cold and clear, while others were used for industrial purposes or flushing the sewers because the water was harder or more prone to cloudiness. They were treating water like a utility, a massive, state-sponsored infrastructure project that allowed Rome to become the first city in history to reach a population of over 1 million people. Except, as impressive as the Roman stone arches were, they were actually trailing behind an even older and more ingenious system developed in the deserts of ancient Persia. About 3,000 years ago, Persian engineers perfected the cannet. These were long, underground tunnels that tapped into the water table in the foothills of mountains and carried it for miles through the burning desert to reach settlements in the lowlands. Because the water was traveling deep underground, it didn't evaporate in the sun, and it was kept perfectly clean from surface contamination. These cannets were hand-dug by specialized laborers who used vertical shafts for ventilation and access. It is one of the most sustainable and clever water management systems ever devised, and remarkably, tens of thousands of them are still functioning today across the Middle East and North Africa. They are silent, subterranean monuments to a time when humans learned to outsmart the sun and the soil just to get a cold drink. Now, we often look at these ancient solutions, the wells, the fermentation, the aqueducts, and we see them as triumphs of primitive ingenuity. And they were. But we have to look at the other side of the ledger, the part that history books often gloss over. For all their cleverness, our ancestors were fighting a war they were mostly losing. We can talk about the brilliant Roman plumbing all day, but the reality is that for most of human history, infant mortality was staggering, and the #1 cause of death for children was waterborne illness. You could build the most beautiful aqueduct in the world, but if a single person with cholera washed their clothes near the source, the entire city could be decimated in a week. They were practicing blind science. They had the right behaviors, boiling, filtering, seeking mountain springs, but they didn't know the why. And because they didn't know the why, they couldn't see the failures coming until it was too late. To truly understand how we got to the safety of your kitchen tap, we have to look at the moment the veil was finally lifted. It didn't happen in a desert or a Roman forum. It happened in a crowded, filthy neighborhood in London in 1854. This is the story of the Broad Street pump and a physician named John Snow. At the time, the prevailing wisdom was the miasma theory, the idea that diseases like cholera were spread by bad air or foul smells. It made sense to the senses. Cities smelled terrible, and people in cities got sick. But John Snow suspected something else. He noticed that the deaths in a particular cholera outbreak were clustered around a single public water pump on Broad Street. He did something no one had ever done before. He mapped the deaths. He realized that even people who lived far away but worked near the pump, or who preferred the taste of its water, were the ones dying. Snow's breakthrough was the final piece of the puzzle that our ancestors had been trying to solve for 50,000 years. He proved that the enemy wasn't a spirit or a smell, but a physical, biological entity that lived in the water itself. When he famously removed the handle of the Broad Street pump, the outbreak stopped. This was the birth of modern epidemiology and the death of the mystery. It led to the Great Stink of London a few years later, which finally forced the government to build a massive, integrated sewer system that separated human waste from drinking water once and for all. It was the moment we stopped guessing and started knowing. We began using sand filtration on a massive, industrial scale, passing the city's water through acres of fine grit to replicate what the earth had been doing for us in secret since the Neolithic. This transition from instinct to industry changed the very fabric of human life. In the early 1900s, cities began adding chlorine to their water supplies, a move that is estimated to have saved more lives than almost any other medical intervention in history. Suddenly, the wasting sicknesses that had been a constant shadow over every family for millennia simply vanished. We grew taller, we lived longer, and we became more productive. But we also became more forgetful. We lost that visceral, sensory connection to the water. We stopped smelling the air for rot and stopped watching the birds for a sign of safety. We outsourced our survival to an invisible army of chemists and engineers, and in doing so, we tucked the most dangerous part of human history away behind a drywall and a chrome faucet. But nature is patient, and it doesn't care about our inventions. Even today, in the most advanced cities on Earth, that invisible system is constantly under threat. We saw it in Flint, Michigan, where a change in water chemistry caused lead to leach from old pipes, poisoning an entire generation. We see it in the rising levels of forever chemicals, like PFAS that our current filters aren't designed to catch. We are still, in many ways, those same parched humans walking through the forest, trying to figure out if the water is a gift or a trap. The only difference is that our senses are now digital sensors and laboratory reports, and the stakes have never been higher. We have built a civilization that is entirely dependent on a level of water purity that is biologically unnatural. We have stepped out of the cycle of the wilderness and into a sterilized bubble, and the walls of that bubble are thinner than we like to admit. Think about the sheer amount of energy and intelligence that goes into making sure your water doesn't kill you. There are people whose entire careers are dedicated to measuring the parts per billion of a single type of bacteria. There are gargantuan reservoirs protected by armed guards and vast networks of pipes that are constantly being monitored for the slightest drop in pressure. This is a monumental, collective effort that happens every second of every day, just so you can have that mindless, late-night glass of water. It is a victory of the human spirit over a microscopic world that wants to consume us from the inside out. We are the survivors of 100,000 generations of people who had to be smarter than the water they drank. We are the children of the well diggers, the small beer brewers, and the aqueduct builders. But don't let that comfort you too much. The reality is that the safe water we enjoy today is a temporary truce, not a permanent peace. We have pushed the invisible killers back into the shadows, but they are still there, waiting in the stagnant ponds and the aging pipes. They are in the runoff of our industrial farms and the warming waters of a changing climate. Our ancestors knew something we've forgotten, that the earth is always trying to reclaim its purity by filtering out the things that don't belong, including us. They lived with a constant, humming awareness that every sip was a choice between life and a very painful, very quick end. They respected the water because they knew it held the power to create civilizations and the power to wipe them out without a trace. So, the next time you stand at that sink, listen to the sound of the water hitting the glass. Notice how clear it is. Notice the complete absence of any scent or taste. It is a beautiful, artificial, fragile thing. You are holding a product of 5,000 years of engineering and 5 million years of evolution. You are drinking the distilled wisdom of every grieving parent who learned too late that the river was a lie. You are partaking in a miracle so common that it has become boring. But in the grand timeline of our species, this era of safe water is a tiny, flickering candle in a very long, very dark night. We have spent our entire history trying to make the invisible visible, trying to see the killer in the cup before we take a drink. And we have succeeded for now. We have built a world where you can be thirsty and not be afraid. But as you finish that glass and turn off the tap, remember that the silence that follows isn't just the quiet of your house. It's the silence of a world where we no longer have to listen to the water to know if it's going to kill us. We have forgotten the language of the wilderness, and we have traded our instincts for infrastructure. We trust the system because we have no other choice. But never forget that beneath the pavement and behind the walls, the old world is still there, patient and persistent. The water is always looking for a way back in, and it doesn't care if you're ready for it. The glass is empty. The thirst is gone. You put the cup back on the counter and walk away. You've survived another day just like your ancestors did. But they survived by paying attention, and you survived by ignoring everything. We have finally reached the summit of our ingenuity, a place where we can be completely oblivious to the very thing that keeps us alive. It is a comfortable place to be, but it is also a dangerous one. Because when you stop looking for the danger, you stop seeing the signs when the danger finally arrives. We are the first humans in history who get to be truly blissfully unaware of what we're putting into our bodies. It's a luxury that would have terrified your great-grandparents. They knew that water isn't just a resource, it's a living, breathing, and often hungry force of nature. They knew that you should never trust a still pool, never ignore a strange smell, and never, ever drink without a prayer. We don't pray anymore, we just turn the handle. We have conquered the invisible, or so we tell ourselves. But as you drift off to sleep tonight, just remember that the pipes are old, the earth is shifting, and the things that used to kill us haven't gone away. They're just waiting for the pressure to drop. The tap is closed, but the river is still running.